The Book of Mormon and the Bible, both books, do not teach a theology of importance concerning the gifts of the Spirit. Both of them teach a theology of difference. Not importance, but difference. That's critical. That distinction is critical. Take, for example, the words spectacular, inferior, major, and minor. These terms only have significance if a classification where such terms possess a comparative and evaluative significance are important. What if, however, the Book of Mormon and the Bible did not present a classification of importance? Then such terms are meaningless. And that's exactly my point. Comparative terms are meaningless when discussing the gifts. In fact, it's misleading. To say that one gift is different from another is not to compare or to evaluate its importance. Something can be different and not more or less important. Paul tells us, he says, that's a trap. That is a trap, says the Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 21. Paul says, the eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of you. Or in today's vernacular, I'm better than you, or I'm more important than you. Nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. The only thing the hand can ever say to the foot is, I'm different than you. Can you picture your foot looking at your hand and saying, sorry, I'm just more spectacular? I'm being a little facetious on purpose, but I try not to grieve the Spirit. That's my point. We can never say, and I'm going to go on, we can never say that certain gifts, like wisdom, the gift of wisdom and knowledge, tend to make us more mature, while certain gifts, tongues and healing, tend to keep us unstable and immature. You can't say that. You can say that if you adopt Paul's trap of a theology of importance. Now, I know you've been taught that since 1937 to 1975 in your church literature. Let me go on. Third misconception. Well, Brother Lynn, you know tongues are for unbelievers. They're a sign to unbelievers. I think I know where that comes from. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 22, Paul did say, tongues are for a sign to them that believe, but to them that believe not. Oh, let me read that again. Tongues are for a sign, not to them that believe, but to them that believe not. That's what he said. But let me read on. Let me finish the sentence. But prophesying serves for them which believe. Now let me read the whole sentence. Paul said, again, verse 22, chapter 14, 1 Corinthians, tongues are for a sign, not to them that believe, but to them that believe not. But prophesying serves for them which believe. I cannot wrap my mind around it that some of the gifts are for believers and some are for unbelievers. Again, I believe the misunderstanding comes from lumping in all tongues together. This passage, if you'll back up one verse, 21, I quoted 22. Look at the verse 21. Paul's talking about the tongues of other lips. Now, he's talking about dialects here. Tongues of dialect was heard on the day of Pentecost. Now here's the deal. Two possible meanings there. The Jews either spoke in their own native tongue, and the Cretes and the Arabians and all the other countries heard them speaking in their own dialect. That's one possible. Or the Jews were, in fact, supernaturally speaking their language. To me, it's half a dozen, 1/6 the other. It's not worth my quibbling over. I was listening to 700 Club, and Pat Robertson had a missionary on. He heard of a British minister smuggling Bibles into Russia. And the British minister was speaking to the Russians in English, and they heard him speaking in Russian. And they spoke to the minister from Britain in English, but he heard the Russians, or they spoke in Russian, and the British minister heard them in English. That's tongues of other lips. And that's why Joseph once did say, tongues were given for the purpose of preaching among those whose language is not understood. The prophet did say that. That's one of the purposes, though. My question is, how many tongues are there? Well, let me try. Number one, 2 Nephi chapter 13, verse 17. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1. We know there are tongues of angels. Number two, Acts 2, we know there are tongues of dialect. Number three, Acts 10:46, we know there are tongues of prophecy. And I know there are more. Adam's tongue, for one. Then why would someone say tongues are for unbeliever? Because tongues of lips are, but the others are not. Okay, let me go on. The last misconception. Are you doing okay? Okay. Oh, I got to tell you this. I heard Don Basham years ago. He was one of the fathers of the charismatic renewal back in the 70s. I heard him tell this story. During the Korean War, there was an American GI who went over and fought in South Korea. Fell in love with a Korean lady and married her. Brought her back home to the States. He's a Christian. She was a Buddhist. And they made an agreement. He lived in, the GI, the veteran soldier, lived in a little town in Wisconsin. And she agreed to go to church with him every Sunday. And they agreed. While the soldier, the American soldier, the husband is worshiping his God, Jesus, she would sit there in church and worship Buddha. And this was one of the charismatic Episcopal churches in the beginning 70s. And the husband and wife, after service, one of the services, went up and knelt at the altar. And the husband was here, the lovely Korean wife was here, and a little old lady, Wisconsin, never been out of the state of Wisconsin, was kneeling to the right of the Korean wife. And this little old lady from Wisconsin begins to pray. And in the middle of her prayer, she was praying in tongues. The Korean wife grabs her husband and says, "Listen." He said, "Listen what? Listen to her." He said, "What's she saying?" He said, "Well, first of all, she just called me by my temple name, Buddhist temple name." He said, "You don't even know that." And second of all, she's speaking in high Korean dialect. We only speak that dialect in the temple. And he said, "Well, what's she saying?" She said, well, she just said, "You have tried Buddha and he hasn't helped. Why don't you try Jesus?" Tons of other lips. Let me go on. Finally, our last misconception. Brother Lynn, we need to be careful once especially the gifts begin to operate. We don't emphasize them over the fruit of the Spirit. I could not agree more, really, honestly. But actually, that concern is moot. Let me tell you why. Our God, the Christian God, is not atomistic. He's holistic. You can't divide God up. Our Father is not looking down from heaven and saying, oh yeah, that group over there or that person over there, I'm going to give that group or person 60% gifts, 40% fruit. This group, they're kind of rowdy. I'm going to give them 80% gifts and 20% fruit. Because they need to be gossiped about. They're rowdy. No, I'm being facetious. God comes with his gifts. They're the gifts of the Spirit. The emphasis is upon of the Spirit. Point number one, God cannot be divided up. He's holistic. Point number two, I'm done. It does take both fruit and the gifts. It does. It does take character and charisma. It takes both. It does. And I like the way one brother puts it. He says, I'm not impressed with a person who has no or little character. I'm not impressed. But I'm not happy unless he has power. I thought that's a good way to put it. Yes, character is important. But I submit the best way to get character is let the power of God change you.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yes.
How do you change your character? One of my favorite quotes, my lovely wife doesn't like this quote, but can a leopard change his own spots? So I want to finish quoting from one of my books. I love what a Messianic Jew had to say about this matter. We need both. His name is Keith Entrater. I quote the Jewish brother, Messianic. Brother Keith says, charisma without character is void. It's insincere. It's deceptive. Character without charisma is lifeless, vain, and falls short of the true character of God. This guy's pretty good. He says charisma without character is illegitimate. Character without charisma is not sourced by the Spirit of God. Charisma without character, I'm still quoting, charisma without character is not really charisma at all, but a counterfeit of it. Character without charisma is not character at all, he says, but a form of humanism. I wish we could get that. And then he goes on to say, most people, and I add most Christians, most people tend to emphasize one side or the other. They are usually more charisma-oriented or character-oriented, and we run into this. Whichever side one is on, he tends to be biased toward that side and to lean away from the other. You ask Larry why the place is not full. I think I put my finger on it. This is not a criticism, it is an observation. Within the Restoration Saints, and I use that generically, not sectarian. If you're a Book of Mormon believer, you're a Restoration Saint. There's a bias toward character. Whichever side one is on, he tends to be biased toward that side and tends to lean away from the other. Both sides are fully necessary without exception. End of quote. Now, here's what I added to it in my book. Okay, I'm quoting myself. I'm done. Which I might add, I I might add, more times than not, leads to excuse making. The person who moves in the supernatural may justify ignoring some area of his or her personal development by pointing to the grace of God, thinking he's covered. Well, God's grace covers it all. Whoops, that's abusing grace, said Paul. We who lean in the charismatic circles tend to do that. Well, you know, love of God, God's grace. Don't go there. The person, on the other hand, who is character-oriented may point to those crazy charismatics who at times do live, I'm including myself, I are one, who at times do live lives of self-aggrandizement. And the character-oriented believer oftentimes points, well, I know people who move in the gifts of the Spirit, they're insincere. I say this, both sides are wrong. And one excuse does not validate the other.